Okay, so we'll kick off with 2 minutes past the hour. So thanks for those that have joined, and welcome to Block's, I guess, second of the week Block Breakfast Club. This one's on networking and leveraging Wi-Fi to support COVID response. So appreciate you joining. Rob, if you can go to the next slide. So in terms of today, just to do a few quick introductions. My name's Dan Whiston. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Director of Digital Transformation at Block. Been with Block about 2 years now, was before that a customer for a number of years. And I'm sort of 20 years healthcare. So previous role before Block was as Director of Transformation and Director of IT at a large trust in the West Midlands. Rob Brady's joined us today, and he's one of our solution consultants. We'll be talking through number of areas on this in a minute, and John Monaghan, a colleague from Cisco, technical solution consultant, who will also be looking at covering some of the pieces off as well. So in terms of Rob's area, Rob's going to talk about DNA spaces, looking at the application and how it can be kind of used within the response from a COVID perspective. But also on top of that, obviously we're at a point of kind of heightened criticality at the moment, but how we can look at leveraging DNA spaces beyond COVID and looking at how Wi-Fi can be used in terms of communication to both patients, to staff and visitors as well. He's then going to look at a number of more traditional use cases, things in terms of location analytics and what those use cases can bring as well. John will then talk more, I guess, more technically in terms of what's happening, looking at emerging technologies from a camera perspective, number of the innovations that Cisco are doing at the moment with number of organizations, and also things like Bluetooth beacons, and looking at how kind of those augmented data points can be used to again improve the optimization of your network, looking at use cases of how things can be done differently. Both Block and Cisco have been working or in fact Rob, I and John have been working for a number of months now, probably 6-7 months, as to how this technology can be used in a more effective way. And one of the call outs we've got today, and hopefully you'll see it in both the presentations that the guys will do, but one of the kind of calls to arms at the end of this is we're running an innovation program at the moment between Cisco and Block in identifying and working with trusts to identify use cases for them. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. One is that we want to make sure that it's not just from a technology perspective that the technology is understood, but actually how can we support clinical use cases, operational use cases, driving financial efficiency through this technology. So we're looking for a number of trusts to work with to define those use cases, and ultimately Cisco are helping us fund this in terms of then supporting you in writing business cases to be able to go to your boards and articulate how the technology can really drive digital transformation at your trusts and at healthcare organisations in general. So certainly at the end, we'd be very, very keen either during this session or afterwards to speak to you if you'd like to work with us. And we've got a whole methodology that's been set up around this, working between Cisco and Block to define and work with clinicians, operational managers, finance, and clearly the technologists as well, to then move that forward and really start to craft how you can drive this technology into your organisations. So before I kind of get onto the main event, if you like, I'm just going to go through, if you can go to the next slide, Rob. That's great. So before we start on those bits specifically, I thought it would be interesting to just give you guys 5 minutes on what Block have been doing for the last sort of 5-6 months as we've been through these extraordinary times, and some of the things that certainly we're very proud of as an organisation and as a set of individuals working for Block that Block have supported and driven. The first of which is the Nightingale Hospitals. So back in March, we were asked by Barts as the first instance through Sarah Jensen and through her connections with Mark Chang, our founder and CEO, to work on the setup and delivery of the IT infrastructure at the Excel Centre. Incredibly complex and fast-moving piece of work. So we were working both with Bath staff, obviously, but with the Army, with architects, engineers and tradesmen to set that up. And that was a piece of work that I think ordinarily would take a trust and a supplier a year, well over a year to set up. It was a hugely complex piece of work, looking at integration of medical equipment, CT scanners, clinician communication, all of the video consultation, and the normal kind of Wi-Fi configuration. but equally integration and configuration so that they were able to leverage their EPR as well. So they're running Cerner. And a bit of work we're incredibly proud of in terms of the fact that we had a team on site working with our Barks colleagues literally within hours. We had kit there, again, working in hand with Cisco as well. We had kit there within 24 hours, and that was set up pretty much within a week, although we were on site for a lot longer than that. Once the Excel Centre was set up, we were also at the other 8 asked to do Yorkshire and Humber as well, and also North Bristol down at the University of West England. So those two certainly weren't as big, but nonetheless important and you know as complicated. And in total, in terms of size, I think it was a total of sort of 1,200 switches we installed. 1,700 IP phones, and Sarah Jensen was quoted as saying there was 27 kilometres of cable laid and 18,000 endpoints, so significant amount of works that went into that. I've added in the deck, Rob, if you can go to the next slide, just a couple of photos, I guess just for interest. They certainly interest me just to show you guys the scale of what went on. So you can see there on the right hand side, one of the halls at Excel. And I guess for me, certainly that depicts, number one, the size of it, and number two, just the scale of it in terms of the amount of individuals, and the other picture there, just the amount of kit that was put out. And then almost more powerfully, but at the other end of the scale, Rob, if you can go to the next slide, the end of that after the week's work, and obviously this looked very similar at all 3 of the hospitals that we worked at in terms of Nightingale, but a finished and completed ward and also a bed bay there. So you know, as I said at the beginning, incredibly proud of that, because ultimately those are there to save lives of very sick people. Clearly we've all been very lucky that none of those hospitals have been leveraged and reached anything like a capacity, but still kind of remain there as we potentially look at any sort of second wave, and you know, very proud that we were able to be involved in that. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, Rob. So a couple of other pieces that we've been working on as COVID's hit. The next one that I'll just briefly touch upon is the remote access for clinicians. So again, as we went into lockdown, we had numerous calls from many organisations, as I'm sure lots of suppliers did, but to look at how our customers could leverage our primary care desktop, which is a VMware architecture. Number of trusts that we supported there in terms of really significantly ramping up their capacity very quickly. So places like Birmingham and Solihull, we added an additional 1,000 concurrent users. Telford and Wrekin moving from 150 to 650, and Bart, who probably our largest customer there, in fact by quite a way, but they installed and uprated to another 2,000 concurrent users, and that as a set of technology, you know, was tremendously supportive of them in terms of their ability during lockdown to become flexible and fleet of foot. And not just from a clinical point of view. So although that provided access to things like EMIS and System 1 and you know, a generic set of clinical solutions so that clinicians could work remotely, which was clearly critical. But the other side of that was the run rate piece around corporate services and the ability to allow our customers to allow their non-clinical staff to work remotely and support those clinicians moving forward. So lots of great work that was going on there. And then the final 2 pieces before I hand over to Rob to get to the main event, as it were. Again, as COVID hit, we had numerous calls and requests around WebEx and ramp up of kind of remote working. So we installed, I think, a total of 5,000, or enabled a total of 5,000 WebEx accounts for users across 8 trusts. That was everything from kind of syncing with Active Directory, but again, giving trusts and giving our customers the opportunity to deliver more flexible care as this situation hit. And clearly that's kind of still going at the moment. So I won't go through all of them, but places like Sheffield Teaching, Oxford University Hospital, Nottingham University Hospital, some to name. And then finally, before I do hand on, those 3 really have been inherently operationally critical in terms of supporting our customers. And the final one is more of a developmental thing that we're working on at the moment, which is enabling remote clinics. So before COVID hit, we started working on the development of a remote consultation solution, looking, and there's lots of those out there, but looking specifically at how you can drive efficiency into the administration part of that. And we've worked with a number of trusts, UHCW being a real kind of patron of ours in supporting us at both a technical and a transformational level of doing that. But we're really keen and continue to do that to develop this system to provide the NHS with something that is delivered and developed by the NHS for the NHS, and really tries to provide something that longer term can be used, not just during COVID, but as the patterns of work change as we move to a virtual world, in probably as, you know, an overused term at the moment, but as what the new normal becomes. And certainly, as I say, we're continuing that development as we speak. So hopefully those are providing some sort of interest to you. I'll now hand over to Rob, who will start to talk around DNA Spaces, Block's view, and he will then hand over to John to look at it from a Cisco specific point of view. What I would say, if you have any questions as this goes on, please send those in. Hopefully we'll have about sort of 10-15 minutes at the end to start going through those questions, but feel free to add them now, and we'll look at them. We'll look at them in a bit. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Dan. Okay, yeah, so I suppose when we first started talking about doing this webinar, that was probably 6 to 8 weeks ago, and probably I feel that even in that short space of time, where we are in terms of the COVID response and the demands that are being placed upon everybody, they've continued to evolve significantly, I would say. So when we're looking at a hospital now, we've still got 3 profiles of people that are going to be on site, and that's going to be your staff, your patients, and then your visitors. So as we look to reopen services and we look to implement new ways of working or social distancing guidance, things like that, there's a range of feedback that we believe will be really interesting and useful for NHS trusts to actually understand how the space is actually being used. So are the guidelines being followed to allow a trust to communicate more directly with patients, staff and visitors using Wi-Fi as a communication medium, doing things like contact tracing, which we've all seen in the media and in other countries is something that is really a hot topic. And then looking at doing, alerting if we've got an area where for some reason there is a high density of people, how do we know about that, and how do we take action and ultimately look to disperse that high density area? And then these 2 final use cases, we're talking about equipment tracking and guidance for getting people from A to B when they are on site. So the final 2, they're kind of partner-led applications that work with the Cisco technology that we're going to be talking about today, but we think that they really have an awful lot of really good use cases to support us as we kind of go back to work. So the first one I'm going to talk about here is insights and visibility. So if we go into any hospital now, any campus, we've obviously seen a change in the way that the physical space is laid out at the start of the pandemic, and obviously a lot of clinics were postponed, and there was a huge shift in sending staff to work from home, and we've introduced one-way systems and prevented visitors from coming onto site. And as the pandemic has evolved, we are starting to now build up the services that are being delivered from the main site. We're starting to have some staff coming back into site as well. So what is essential is that as we take any one of these actions, we're able to understand the impact of that. And there's a feature that's quite neatly called impact analysis. So effectively what we can do there is say, well, up until the 4th of September, this clinic, for example, was closed, or this clinic was open 10 a.m. till 4 p.m. When we've changed that and now it's open at a different time, or it's reopened, what's the impact, and what's the impact in the number of visits that I've got on that given day? the hour of the day that people arrive, the distribution of where those people are in the hospital, and ultimately that allows us to really dive into what's actually going on in the physical space. And this has been something that we have been able to do for quite a while using Wi-Fi and using other technologies. We've been able to see what's going on, but it's almost been a solution without a problem. But it feels now that there's a really tangible use case for this, with obviously all the new guidelines and regulation that we're all having to adhere to on a daily basis. So this next one here is a kind of just a short video. This is an example of something we've done. And traditionally, we've done an awful lot of this with our retail customers. And effectively, what we're showing here is the density of people throughout a given day. So one thing that we've done a lot in the past is to say, well, what's the average journey that people take? When people come in through entrance A, are they more likely to go to certain shops within the centre or go out by certain other exits in the centre? I think now there's a really interesting use case that we can use to apply that same methodology to tracking people following the guidance around one-way traffic around the hospital, and understanding whether having a certain door open and having one door as in, one door as an exit, how that is actually impacting the density of people and the average flow that people are taking. And we're not using anything here like asking people to download an app. We're not needing people to hand over any information. This is just Wi-Fi. It's anonymized information about the average journey that a connected device, and therefore a person, is taking as it comes onto the network. Obviously, the interest there is around the colours and how dense it is at a given time. But clearly, with COVID-19 and the social distancing guidelines, we now have a mandate to restrict the number of people in a given space. So once we understand in a given zone, and a zone can be, as shown on this picture, a zone can be an area, we can define what the limits are for people within that zone. And using the technology that we're talking about here, which is Cisco's DNA Spaces platform, we can then generate an alert when that goes out of compliance. And that alert can be triggered via an SMS, via an email, via an API call to some third-party system, or if you're using Cisco WebEx, it can be via WebEx Teams. And there's lots of options around how we do that, whether it's per location, whether it's per visitor, the amount of density, etc. So there's quite a lot of flexibility within that as a solution. The next topic, which I think is one that's I personally think is very relevant, is around targeting communication. So the background here is that we can use Wi-Fi and onboarding to Wi-Fi as a means for presenting relevant information to those visitors to the site. So with NHS Wi-Fi, that is now pretty much available in almost all primary and secondary care settings, certainly in England. And what that means is that as somebody connects to the Wi-Fi in a given setting, we've got an opportunity to present them with some information. Now, as you can see on the image there, there's some definition around what the colouring and things like that must look like when we're talking about NHS Wi-Fi. But this captive portal page, which you can see on the right, we can use that to provide up-to-date information. So it could be that, as I've shown there, the food outlets are currently closed. We could give information that says visiting is temporarily suspended. We can give information around, a service that's reopened, or closing times, or where to raise help and get further information. And the cool thing about that, when it's compared to physically printing out documentation is that this can be updated really dynamically. We can do this within the Cisco DNA Spaces platform and change the information that's presented to suit an emerging requirement. One of the things that we've been speaking about is the change in social distance regulations and how it's gone from 2 meters down to 1 meter, and the impact that that's had on all the content that's been produced and put out everywhere. Again, Wi-Fi is a proven tool for engaging, and again, that's something that we've used in quite a lot of settings to engage with people. The other thing we can do with this, which I think is quite neat, is that we can customize what's presented to people at different times of the day and in different parts of the hospital, or in say it's a community location. We can have the information pitched differently. So if we know that on the hospital we've got a rule in one entrance, or one entrance is for no visitors, we can make it present that information specific to the area where that person is logging in. For staff, we can do a similar sort of thing where, as somebody arrives onto site, if they opt in to receive notifications, we can send them a text message or an email, and as they arrive onto site and they enter that zone which we've defined, we can send an up-to-date information. That could tell them something as simple as which food areas are open, or where to go for further information. But it can also tell specifics about visitors and staff and things like that. So the next use case is one, again, that I think is really quite powerful, and that's around contact tracing. So this application is actually called proximity reporting within the DNA Space platform. So what we're doing here is taking the data from the Wi-Fi network for all your connected devices and using that to build a report which tells us which devices have come into contact with which other devices and for how long. And this is a really valuable tool, and the benefit to this versus some other solutions is that there's no additional software needed. If you've got a device or a user that's connecting to the network, then it's already on there. This is information that is being logged already. We know it's being processed by the system, and we can see where those interactions happened. And the actions that you take based on this will obviously vary depending on what the purpose of the tracing is, or who they've come into contact with. But again, it's just an extra clue in terms of the response as to what happened when we get a positive test, and how do we know where people have come into contact with one another. And this uses the same sort of technology as was showing earlier, where we break things down into zones. So we say this is a zone. Oh, apologies for that. I think there's a problem with the slides there. Yeah, this is the contact tracing. This is what this looks like. Yes, as you can see on there, we've got type where people have been, who they've been in contact with, and then we can use that to take that. And historically, this would have been a manual process, and we would have taken whatever action was necessary to deal with that. Cisco recently announced an integration with ServiceNow. So ServiceNow have a solution for contact tracing within their software suite. So what they can now do is take that information directly from the Cisco DNA Spaces platform and use that to feed into their tool set. So I know that quite a lot of the trusts that we do work with actually use ServiceNow already. So I think there's a really good use case there for those that have already got a Cisco network and they've already got ServiceNow. These features and this functionality can be layered on top without significant re-engineering of the technology. Okay, so I'm just going to touch now on a couple of the more what I'd call traditional location-based technologies that we've been working with trusts for a number of years. So using our partner, which is typically Stanley Healthcare, we can deliver some solutions such as environmental monitoring. So what we're doing there is we can track the temperature of medicines and generate alerts when anything falls out of compliance. We can do patient call button so the patients are able to just get help when they need it. We're able to track hand hygiene compliance. So that solution uses a combination of Wi-Fi and some other technologies that are actually embedded into the hand washing stations themselves to just give guidance on compliance with hand hygiene regulations. That's clearly something that is very important right now. And then asset and inventory management. So that's really a traditional use case for location analytics in healthcare and using Wi-Fi. And that it's how do we locate the nearest wheelchair? How do we locate the nearest respirator? How do we locate the nearest hoist? What we find is that the use cases and what's important varies, and it isn't necessarily the most expensive piece of equipment that's needed that people need to find quickly. It's the one that takes the most time to find. I think we've got a couple of examples of organizations where kit would historically have been going missing, and we just needed to keep replenishing the stock time after time. By deploying an asset tracking solution with Cisco Wi-Fi and Stanley Healthcare technology, we can ultimately reduce the amount of waste around equipment going missing. A couple of extra slides on this. So environmental monitoring. So yeah, again, as I've discussed there, we can deploy sensors which speak over the Wi-Fi network and then integrate with the Stanley software to identify whether there's any challenges with regards to the level of the temperature at which the medicine's being stored. Again, as I just touched on there, clinical asset tracking.
All right. Thanks, Dan and Rob. So John Monaghan, Solutions Architect in Cisco. Dan introduced me at the start, working very closely with Block on these clinical solutions. So in this kind of last section, what I wanted to do was give you a bit of a preview, if you like, and an explanation of the underlying technologies that we're using to support some of these solutions, and also let you know about some of the upcoming innovations that are going to be available based on not just Wi-Fi, but some of our other technologies that we can apply to these clinical problems. So if I can get control here, there we go. So what you're seeing here is what we call our healthcare portfolio. And it basically explains the range of clinical solutions that Cisco currently supports, divided into various different use cases. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go through all of these today on this particular webinar, and instead I've highlighted a few that are of particular relevance because, as I'm sure you are seeing and hearing from Rob and Dan, one of the main themes here is around what we call mobility and mobility related technologies. So how do we make hospitals smarter? How do we use location services to support these environments? How do we deliver an experience back to staff, to visitors, and to patients? And how can we enhance and reduce or increase, should I say, the efficiency of patient observation? So we're going to have a look at a few of these. Just before I do that, however, I want to concentrate on and give, as I say, give you a bit of a preview of the underlying platforms that we use to support these particular use cases. So with Cisco, if you're familiar with us, you'll know that we have been pushing a message for several years now of the network being a platform. So what do we mean by that? Well, it's when it comes to delivering these types of outcomes, these clinical outcomes, it's not a one size fits all approach. It's what we call a multi-sensory strategy and approach. Our technology, of course, will provide, industry-leading secure connectivity, but the technology itself, both the hardware and the software, is also capable of collecting what we call telemetry data, which we can then expose to Cisco applications, but more typically our partner applications to deliver these types of services. So some of the examples that you're seeing on this slide here. So of course, Wi-Fi is often the best starting point. As Rob was saying, because it's so prevalent, right? Pretty much every NHS trust has Wi-Fi installed, and a lot of people are just not even aware that we can use Wi-Fi as a sensor to collect data and then expose this data over what we call APIs. But we can also collect data from what Cisco calls the collaboration endpoints. So these are in-room or even desktop video systems that have got high definition cameras and microphones, so they can count the number of people in the close vicinity of those video systems, and again, feed that data to external systems. We are also now extensively using our camera portfolio from our Meraki product line. That camera portfolio is called MV Sense. I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a few minutes time, but that is capable of delivering very rich data for analytical purposes. And last but not least, we're also creating a framework that allows us to support third-party sensors and third-party devices as well, because of course, we don't make and manufacture all of these types of sensing devices that can collect additional data on the environment. So it's very important that we're able to connect to those devices securely and bring that data up into our platforms like DNA Spaces that Rob was discussing in his section. But the role of our ecosystem cannot be overstressed here. Rob mentioned a company called Stanley Healthcare, so they are a primary ecosystem partner in of course healthcare, but there are a whole range of other companies that we work with where we feed all of this data through to them through these platforms, and they deliver the outcome that is required by the line of business, typically the clinicians in the hospital environment. So I just want to make the point, stress the point here, that it's not a one size fits all. Yes, you will put in Cisco technology for secure connectivity, but on the back of that, you're going to get this rich sensory telemetry type data that we can then feed up into either Cisco applications like DNA Spaces or pass through to third-party systems in the form of our ecosystem. Okay, so what we wanted to talk to you about here was also how we're evolving these underlying platforms. If we go back to Wi-Fi, Wi-Fi is a very interesting case in point. So, of course, when Wi-Fi was first introduced into the industry, it was primarily, and probably still is primarily, used for connectivity purposes. So we would kind of call that generation 1. Then, of course, we realized that we could use Wi-Fi for its sensing capabilities. And the primary use cases there would be the ability to locate personal devices, so smartphones and laptops and tablets, so we can extract analytical data on the movement patterns and the dwell times of individual people, and Rob showed you some examples of that. And of course, use Wi-Fi enabled tags to track physical assets. So that's when we moved into generation 2, and that capability has been with us for several years now, and it's pretty mature technology. And we would always say to our customers, please have a look at this. If you've got a Wi-Fi network, you know, you're missing a trick, right? If you don't exploit that Wi-Fi network for tracking analytical purposes as well. But we're about to move into what we call the 3rd gen of Wi-Fi, which is when we start to combine Wi-Fi with the world of IoT, the Internet of Things, of course, an often very overloaded term that we hear about in the media. But what we really mean by IoT in this context is the ability to embrace and support these third-party sensing devices that are manufactured by a whole wide variety of different vendors, and that are gradually being installed into the physical environments like hospitals to measure and monitor a whole wide variety of different types of parameters. And we'll have a look at some of that. But the challenge there historically has been that these third-party devices don't speak Wi-Fi, and in order to connect these devices, you need to install an additional, what sometimes we call an overlay network, which adds to both the capital and operational expenditure, right? And we've always been asking ourselves the question, why can't we use the network that's already there, right? Because our customers, you know, have invested in Cisco with our partners like Block. So it just makes logical sense for us to be able to reuse that investment, enhance that investment to support IoT devices. So another, as I mentioned in my kind of second slide there, another very important platform that we can apply to these problems is the MV camera product line from Cisco Meraki. A few important things to stress. If you haven't heard about this camera line, I strongly encourage you to go and read up on it and come back to either Cisco or Block to find out more. But we are positioning this very, very much as a super sensor. So not only is it an enhanced imaging device for capturing live images, as you can see from the screenshots here, we can also use that camera to capture analytical data. So in other words, it can detect events, which we can then send over the API to instruct or inform external systems that something interesting or something unusual might have happened. And of course, cameras have been traditionally used to support safety and security use cases, and that will continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. But we are saying to our customers, look, if you put these cameras in, you're also able to use them for many, many other purposes, object detection, person detection. Cameras, if they are positioned correctly, can be much more accurate than Wi-Fi. So you can closely monitor the crowding and the density of people and whether queues are building up or queues are dispersing, and monitor footfall and so on. So there's a huge variety of use cases that we can unlock with the camera capabilities. You will get functionality out the box with Cisco Meraki through the camera dashboard. So these cameras are cloud managed, which significantly reduces the overhead, because most camera systems rely on on-premise what are called NVR, network video systems or DVR systems to store and process all the video frames. So we are saying that you don't need to do that anymore. You can manage it all from the cloud, and you only need to export the video that you actually need. In fact, let the camera do a lot of the hard work to detect these unusual occurrences. There's a good anecdote that we often tell people that less than 1% of video footage is actually watched. So you've got to ask your question, what happens to the other 99%? And often what happens in the case of traditional CCTV is you're broadcasting the live images. You have one or more security officers sitting in front of a bank of television screens watching these images, just in the off chance that something unusual might happen, some incident might occur. And as you can imagine, that is tremendously wasteful, right? So what we are saying is, let's use the technology to our advantage. Let's free up these security officers into other tasks where they can be much, much more useful and effective. And let's detect these occurrences and incidences automatically, start informing these external systems so we can take action. And Rob, if you can just move it on one more, please. We've also, again, if you're following the various announcements that Cisco is making, recently we also announced another acquisition. So this is a Swedish company called Modcam that's going to be brought into the Meraki product portfolio. This is a company that not only has some very, very smart people in the area of artificial intelligence and machine vision, but they have technology which allows us to stitch together images from different cameras. And that's a huge problem that the whole industry faces. How do you know if person A in camera 1 is the same as person B in camera 2, right? And Rob talked about the ability to understand, visualize, and monitor the flow of people through a hospital. Well, cameras would be an obvious way to do that, because not everybody has a Wi-Fi device, and Wi-Fi has some accuracy limitations. But the ability to do that accurately requires the ability to stitch together images and recognize the same object or person in different camera frames. And that's what the Modcam acquisition is going to give to Cisco. And of course, we will expose that capability to our partners. Rob, if you can move on, please. Okay, so just going to have a quick look at some of the use cases that these underlying technologies exposed to us, over and above what you've already heard about from Rob. I mentioned the integration of IoT into the Cisco kind of wireless portfolio and wireless product line. The first innovation that we're bringing there is support for Bluetooth Low Energy, BLE. So a lot of us will be familiar with Bluetooth from our kind of lives as consumers, personal life, but BLE has a very, very important role to play in industry as well, especially because it is now highly secure. It is very battery friendly. You can make and manufacture devices that are of a much smaller form factor than the traditional active Wi-Fi tags that we would maybe traditionally used to track something like a wheelchair or an infusion pump. They still have their place to play, of course, and because they can use Wi-Fi, which is prevalent, but the introduction of Bluetooth allows us to tackle a whole new set of use cases and capabilities. So we can track a wider variety of assets in the hospital. We can enhance our wayfinding capability by giving turn-by-turn directions with the strategic placement of BLE-enabled beacons. We can attach BLE tags in the form of wearables to patients so that we can track their movements for clinical purposes. We can also use these wearables, of course, to monitor and track infections. If someone is deemed to be infectious, then who were they recently in contact with? We can use the sensing capabilities of some of these BLE vendors to monitor things like, air quality, temperature, humidity. Some of these sensors will even monitor for the presence of particular types of bacteria like Salmonella. We can monitor if a window or a door has been opened, so we can switch off or on the heating or air conditioning, as the case may be. And the list goes on and on. Water leaks, there's another one, so automatically detecting a leak. And the common denominator here is that these sensors would typically be battery operated and small and placed, at the appropriate point. They will send their data wirelessly over BLE. Now we have the capability within the Cisco infrastructure to detect those signals, send the data up to DNA spaces, and again, re-expose the data along with Wi-Fi data to our application partners. So this is a capability we've just introduced. So we're in what Cisco calls early field trials just now, which is Cisco speak for beta trials. So if you're interested in exploring some of this capability, please let Cisco know or let Rob and Dan know, because we would be, of course, very interested to work with you and explain to you how we can enhance your clinical procedures and processes using BLE technology. Next one, Rob, please. Okay, and keeping on the theme of IoT, Internet of Things, there are a lot of wireless devices inside hospitals that don't use Wi-Fi and don't use BLE, right? And that's for legacy purposes, or also because they serve a particular purpose. They might have a longer range using a particular protocol, or that particular protocol and technology is designed to solve a particular use case, right? So what we're interested here is in supporting as many of these different IoT devices and protocols as possible, so that, as this slide is articulating, we can support more patient care use cases in the form of comfort, hygiene, wellness, and the individual operation of and effectiveness of the faculty, and also, of course, arguably more important in the area of preventative care, right? So COVID-19 contact tracing, temperature checking, sterilizing equipment, maintaining social distancing. There's a lot of devices and sensors out there that will help us solve these problems, but won't use BLE or Wi-Fi. So the question is, how do we support that? So let me explain that by giving you an example. Rob, if you can move on to the next slide, please. So what you're seeing here is a Cisco access point, and that Cisco access point is part of our Wi-Fi 6 family, latest generation of Wi-Fi. And one of the unique features that we have in this product family is the ability to host third-party applications. So we call this application hosting, and what you're now going to get is the ability for one of our partners to actually drop in their own software to run right at the edge on the access point. In addition to that, we can also use an expansion port, a USB port on the access point, to embed a particular type of radio to support these different wireless protocols. So that could be RFID, which operates in the sub-gigahertz band. It could be Zigbee. It could be Z-Wave. It could be ultra-wideband, which operates in, say, 4 to 6 gigahertz to support high precision accuracy. And then some of these sensors that I mentioned for monitoring windows being opened and water leaks, they operate in what's called the ISM band, again, sub-gigahertz, but highly proprietary, right? So we can support that, those protocols, by creating a hardware dongle that slots into the access point, dropping in a software application onto the access point that takes the data and then transmits it. So it might do some filtering and processing and then transmits it securely back through the wired network up to for example, DNA Spaces, or off to the partner application. So the example we're showing here is, a patient who might be bedbound, so that, they're in a ward or in a private room, and they want to adjust their environment, or they want to maybe activate certain services. Again, we're all probably familiar with voice assistants in our personal lives, right? So what we're showing here is the possibility to integrate a voice assistant right into the Cisco Wi-Fi infrastructure. So the patient issues a voice command from their bedside, which might be to adjust the height of the bed. It might be to modify the lighting. It might be to summon or call for help from the medical staff, or modify temperature. It doesn't really matter. We're showing you here the art of the possible, right? You're not having to deploy additional infrastructure. The voice assistant's connected over Wi-Fi to the access point, but there's an application hosted inside the access point which takes these commands and then integrates with these external systems, right, to allow the patient to activate these services. And again, this is just one example. There are many, many more, but we just wanted to show you this to kind of stimulate the conversation and stimulate ideas. Next one, Rob, please. Rob, you mentioned this, so I won't cover this in too much detail. This is the integration with ServiceNow and DNA Spaces. So this goes into the ServiceNow Workplace Suite. So importing contact information from people that may have been in proximity with someone that's been infected, and also where they have been, crucially as well. So you're using the ServiceNow case management tool here to obviously track the cases. Yeah, please go on, Rob, because I'm conscious of time here. The last section I just wanted to cover quite quickly was the use cases around cameras. And Dan, you mentioned at the start, the remote capabilities that you have for diagnostics within Block. And cameras play an important role there for remote patient monitoring. Obviously, medical staff are reduced. They have to do more with less here. So using the cameras, we can enable the clinicians to watch up to 16 patients on what we call a video wall, which obviously would be on a digital screen from one centralized location. So we would have a camera in each patient room to monitor their well-being. And the benefit of that, apart from the obvious economy of scale, is that we minimize the amount of interaction with that patient only as and when needed. So therefore, we minimize the amount of PPE that's being used, but we can also, of course, monitor any visitations into the patient's room and monitor for any social distancing kind of violations, right? So that's a great way to use the cameras to achieve that economy of scale. Next one, Rob. We have, as I mentioned, a number of ecosystem partners that are exploiting the enhanced telemetry and data coming off of the cameras. So this is an ecosystem partner called EveryAngle, one of our leading partners for camera applications. So they have an application that allows us to monitor physical distancing. And of course, this is all subject to the cameras being positioned correctly. But they will let us know whether physical distancing is being maintained. They will let us know of what the demographic mix is. They will let us know what or how that varies over time. And of course, crucially, the remaining capacity that's available in a particular space. And I think might be the last one, Rob, if you just go on. And you touched on this, Rob, right? So every NHS trust, if you go onto their website, they will be talking about and highly focused on visitor management. So managing footfall, limiting the amount of visitations very carefully. The question being, how do you monitor that, right? And we're seeing in healthcare, in retail, there's employees having to stand outside the doors, the entrances, the exits to monitor all this, which is unfortunately necessary but tremendously inefficient. What if we could automate some of that using the cameras, acting as essentially a highly accurate next generation footfall counter? And of course, we can do that. We can monitor ingress and egress, in other words, entrances and exits. We can monitor how that varies over time. And again, we can automate whether or not you're allowed into that particular space because it might already be too full or there might be too many people. We can monitor whether a queue is building up. We can monitor whether social distancing is being maintained. So these use cases will have longevity outside of COVID-19 and the current pandemic, because as I mentioned before, this camera is a super sensor, right? Measuring footfall, one example, but it can also measure, things like disturbances or, obtrusive behavior in accident, in emergency, or somebody in distress. The list is really endless, and that's really the message I just wanted to end with here is by inserting this technology and working with partners like Block, you're going to get access to a really rich, continually evolving set of data that you can use to support a whole range of clinical operations. So I'll stop there, and I think I'm maybe handing back to yourself, Dan.
You are, John.
Yep.
That's great. John, Rob, many thanks for those presentations. Certainly I found it very interesting. I hope the rest of you on the call did. We're obviously at the top of the hour now, so no time specifically for questions. I see, Steve, a question from you. Just very quickly, I'll try and touch upon. So John, this is one for you from your slide deck. On the MV camera, is the heat map IR or a graphical representation of footfall? Are you able to briefly comment on that?
Well, it's not infrared, so it is a graphical representation of footfall. So it is a heat map, which is based on the identification of a human figure. And I want to stress here, Dan, that this is completely GDPR compliant, right? We're not doing facial recognition. We're just recognizing the image of a person. So it's based on the recognition of images of a person in a particular defined area, and that's how we generate the heat map.
That's great. Thank you, John. So I'll just leave you, number one, as I say, thanks to both of our presenters, and thanks to you guys for joining. As we've got up on the slide there, and I said at the beginning of the call, both Block and Cisco are working together on this innovation program. If you are interested in what you've heard today, certainly we'd love to hear from you. There's absolutely no obligation and no cost to any of this, but we'd really like to start to push this technology forward within the NHS and make it as real as possible. So if you'd like to work with us, please get in touch with either myself, Rob, or John, and we'd be glad to kind of talk to you about how we can move that forward. I know we'll send our contact details, both emails and telephone numbers, out after the call. So we'll look forward to speaking to you soon. But thank you for attending. Bye bye.